You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I'm your psychoanalyst host, Abraham.
And I am your cigar-smoking host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast, and we talk about psychology with comedy through a scientific lens. That's what we do.
Yeah, and we have fun with it. We absolutely enjoy this.
And if you like what you hear today and would like to support us, if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And you can support us by leaving us a rating and review. You can subscribe. You can, if you want to throw us a little cash our way, you get some perks for doing that. You can join us over on Patreon. And of course, you can buy some merch. I'll talk more about that at the end of this. But today, we have like the pinnacle of psychology.
How did we get 5 years into this show without talking about this yet, or like diving into the history of this?
It has actually been on the list for nearly 5 years. This was an early topic to talk about that we just never got around to. And I finally was like, nope, it's just got to happen. We're taking it on. We're going to do our best. And that means we're talking about Freud
and psychoanalysis. I don't know if I ever shared the story. I almost got kicked out of my one of my PhD classes. You know, I studied clinical psychology, and I was in a supervision class, and the teacher was like really into psychodynamics.
Oh,
and I was a behavior analyst at the time. And so he would be like, well, you know, you do da-da-da-da. I'm like, the parts that work are behavioral. And he would like get really mad at me. And he actually had to pull me aside and be like, you have got to stop contradicting me in front of the class. And I was like, great, I will contradict you in private over dinner at some point in time, or drinks. Like we'll have this conversation. And so he's like, ugh. Yeah. So I was a little bit of a troublemaker because of this topic specifically.
That's understandable. And that's probably where we're going to mostly come down on that today.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn from this, and it is interesting how it came about and what it had to say. Mm-hmm. And I think, honestly, like it's one of those where I want to be really careful that we're not making a straw man argument. We are going to try and say as objectively and non-judgmentally as possible what psychoanalysis said. And we're going to start, obviously, by just going over the history of it, where it started and how it evolved and that sort of thing, and sort of where it ended up. And then we'll critique it.
I do think it's important too to also note the reason we are even talking about this is because it has been incredibly influential for shaping the field of psychology. It is important to know that it existed and that it does exist, and what it has done to create or at least help kind of provide a perspective and processes within the field of psychology. So like, there's parts of this that will sound like we are being irreverent about this, but it is also like with a healthy respect to the fact that this is something that did truly kind of build foundational work for you know, the field of psychology in general.
Well said. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So did you know, Shane, the etymology of psychoanalysis?
I did not, actually. Should we share it with the folks?
Let's talk about this. Yeah. So psycho comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning soul, mind, or spirit.
Which none of those things exist. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Okay. Let me reframe. Let me reset. Okay. Good. Okay. Objective.
Find your
right,
center.
Here we go. Find your center. Find my objectivity. Okay. Here we go. Okay.
We're just talking.
Go on. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So obviously psyche is recognizable as the root of the word psychology, right? So that's still there. And anything pertaining to it has the same root reference in the prefix of it. And then the word analysis has a few different roots. So there's probably it evolved from a few different places, but essentially referred to this idea of being unloose, set free, or loosened, which interestingly might be interpreted by Freud in a particular way.
Yep.
But anyway, the word analysis was actually used often as an antonym for the word synthesis. And synthesis means to bring constituent parts together to form sort of a complex, comprehensive whole. And instead, analysis meant to break complex things into their constituent parts. So sort of eventually to detangle, to look at, to investigate is a way to think about it. And eventually the word analysis essentially came to mean a statement about the results of the process of breaking something down into its constituent parts.
So, psychoanalysis etymologically refers to conclusions that are drawn from the process of isolating the constituent elements of the mind. A very aptly chosen name for this field, right? So it makes perfect sense. And Freud actually coined this term himself. So it comes directly from the father of this thing.
And so let's talk about Freud, the man, the myth, the erection. Oops. How'd that slip in there?
We've got so many.
Freud was born May 6th, 1856, in what was at the time the Austrian Empire, as now Pribor, I think is how it's said, in the Czech Republic. And Freud spent most of his time, his childhood and his adulthood, in Vienna, where he studied neurology, and he eventually earned his medical doctorate in 1881. And one of his earliest papers, I thought was interesting, was on the benefits of cocaine. So off to a good start.
Yeah.
And while he was there, he had various teaching and lecturing positions, but eventually he did leave the college to go explore other things.
Yeah. So in 1885, I mean, the cocaine thing makes sense in 1985, but in 1885, Sigmund interned with Jean-Martin Charcot, a well-known neurologist. There, Freud was introduced to the miraculous powers of hypnotism. Excited by the effectiveness of hypnosis, he set out to try his hand at incorporating hypnotism into his practice when he established a private medical practice treating people with psychological disorders.
So as the story goes, he became intrigued with a specific patient of Dr. Joseph Brauer, assuming that's how it's pronounced, who is a colleague, and his then patient, Anna O, her name, maybe pseudonym. Anna O was interesting because she exhibited these physical symptoms, but had no apparent physical cause. And further, apparently, using hypnosis, Dr. Breuer was successful, as is reported, at treating her symptoms when he helped her, quote unquote, recover traumatic, repressed memories.
And we'll kind of unpack that as we go. Now, wherever Freud was at professionally, spiritually, academically, or whatever, this was apparently one of the, if not the boulder that kicked off the world-changing avalanche of theories and ideas that Freud would soon be publishing. So this was kind of like his Kickstarter. This was the thing that was like his catalyst to go forward, right? So, and now in addition to this, and part of the complex network of juices feeding the gestating psychoanalytic theory, many Freudian scholars and Freud himself consider the studies on quote, hysteria, which means wandering womb, FYI, to be one of the inspirations for the beginning of psychoanalysis theory and practice. And we'll talk about more later as we get into this, why these were important. So we're actually going to dive into that a bit.
Now, although he was initially really intrigued with this whole hypnosis thing, he seemed to eventually find hypnosis to be too inconsistent and unwieldy to be able to continue to use it as a primary technique, which is, in my opinion, kind of ironic considering his later practice.
Yeah.
But instead, he preferred to let patients explore their thoughts and emotions in an unrestricted, unguided way. And this would, of course, be the beginning of the use of the idea of free association, a common technique in psychoanalysis. And we're not going to dig into a lot of the specific techniques, but we'll reference that again later when we are talking a bit more about sort of what psychoanalysis is composed of.
A few more things about Freud. He was an atheist, although of Jewish descent. So he and his family of 6 children and some grandchildren had to flee Austria in 1938 due to the rise of Donald Trump. Sorry, I got something stuck in my throat. We meant the Nazi regime, the rise of the Nazi regime at that time.
Tomato.
Call a spade, if you will, you know. He was also a heavy smoker, originally of cigarettes, but later cigars. He likened the habit of smoking to a, quote, substitute for masturbation, end quote. So him and the Kellogg's guy would get along real well. So, do with that what you will. He was treated on numerous occasions for cancer related to his smoking, including mouth cancer. So he actually did receive some treatment for that.
Unfortunately for him, his cancer became so painful and eventually so inoperable that he requested assisted suicide by a lethal dose of morphine. And it was actually from this specifically that he passed away on September 23rd, 1939 in London, England, which I didn't know that was how he passed.
I didn't know either. That's interesting.
So why are we talking so much about Freud? Well, if it isn't obvious, he is essentially the sole catalyst that kicked off the psychoanalysis revolution that would rocket to popularity at nearly every level of public discourse. If not the name of psychoanalysis, then many of the ideas and terms, such as anal retentive, is one you may have heard, or simply anal, came from psychoanalytic theory. And the idea of someone laying on the couch also came from psychoanalytic theory. So for a therapeutic sort of session, I mean, this became just a part of the cultural sort of awareness and consciousness, and it even became sort of the defining therapy of psychology.
I think it's important to note that his work would spawn so much debate that you had offshoots of psychologists that would say, you know what, that's not quite right. Here's what I think it is. And they would actually kind of like lean on debating Freud and his work to create new theories in the field and make new discoveries. So like, he's not just important for psychoanalysis, he's important for all of psychology in that space too.
Right, exactly. And we'll talk more about how that sort of diverged over time.
Yeah. So I guess the question we have to kind of ask up front here is, what is psychoanalysis? Or I'm sorry, psychoanalysis. I keep getting something stuck in my throat. It's been a trying day.
Was it
real hard day?
I mean, a peanut?
Yeah, just like I had peanuts. It's so hard.
It's so girthy. So interesting. Psychoanalysis might refer to any combination of sort of three categories you're talking. And even I think many would argue more than that. And this number 3 is going to be very important in this episode. It comes back time and time again.
Yes.
But psychoanalysis could be a theory, a treatment intervention, or an investigative tool. And so there's sort of different ways of looking at what this could even be in those different spaces. And so theory essentially being just sort of describing how the mind works. Treatment intervention, meaning you use psychoanalysis to help someone who who's suffering in some way mentally. An investigative tool might be that you use this to determine what the cause of the suffering is, and then you might use some other tool to then treat that cause. So there's sort of the 3 different ways that, and maybe all simultaneously, it could be referred to all 3 of those things, but that's what it sort of is.
Yeah, and much of the original aim of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic tool could be described as healing psychological problems by facilitating the release of suppressed or repressed emotions and memories. You'll see that kind of theme come up a lot as well. And these ideas of the unconscious, hidden meaning, and repression, it's really the core of that psychoanalytic theory. In fact, Freud himself stated that the unconscious was the cornerstone of psychoanalysis, and the repression of thoughts and memories was a prototype of the unconscious.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and start with psychoanalysis as theory, and we'll break down those 3 that we mentioned, the repression and consciousness and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All right, so most people have probably heard in some capacity this term repression, and repression refers to the idea that thoughts, emotions, and memories may become inaccessible to us in a sense that we cannot, or at least no longer attempt to recall those memories or engage in those thoughts or emotions. Now, without unpacking that a lot, because if you're hearing that for the first time and you weren't sure what this meant, you might be wondering what you mean by recall. I would hope that you are wondering that, and I think that's reasonable. So we'll assume at this point, again, trying to be as charitable as possible, that by recall, he meant that we could not speak of the memory, thought, or emotion voluntarily if asked to do so. Specifically, these memories and thoughts are rendered inaccessible because, again, according to Freud, our minds, without explicit permission, chose to shield us from the pain of those experiences by purging them from our waking lives. And so, according to Freud, repression creates the unconscious mind.
Okay, so unconscious is another term that rests heavily on the communal mystical familiarity with the term, and never mind what it means, la la la, I can't hear you, I'm not listening, blah blah blah. But if we simply break it down into what we are observing when we evoke the term unconscious, it seems to only refer to whether or not we could verbally name something if asked to do so. I can label the way I'm sitting and maybe it's uncomfortable. I can label that my hunger is currently satiated. I cannot label that while my attention was focused, several sounds occurred outside of my window or in my house, but I ignored them so thoroughly that they are not part of my contextual memory of this moment. I cannot label that my pancreas is working hard to produce enzymes to help me digest food that has me feeling sufficiently fed. So there are a lot of things that we cannot label, but this is a little bit different. Or at least the way he's kind of describing it is a little bit different.
We can't know what unconscious means, and the way that he was using it, he just sort of said, it's our unconscious. We don't know. Okay. And so we're trying to figure out what that could mean. And essentially, it seems to at least refer in some way to the fact that we can't label it, or because it's not a sensation or experience that we can readily identify as happening or having happened. Mm-hmm. So the proposal here is that without doing any critical examination of these terms, as we go about the world, the painful and unpleasant experiences that are traumatic that we go through are then repressed and made unavailable to our conscious mind. And the purpose of this is to protect us from the pain of those experiences. However, the emotional weight of those experiences is not gone and instead bubble to the surface. This, I think, comes straight from Freudian language, in what Freud termed sort of a return of the repressed, like a ghostly revenant. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this pain that bubbles to the surface, these appear in slips of the tongue. So often called Freudian slips, as we've demonstrated several times throughout this discussion already. That also includes jokes, like the humor one might use, and dreams as well, is a place where unconscious mind can sort of be let loose. And so there's a lot of bubbling to the surface of the unconscious. And thus the symptoms of repression can contain hidden meaning that must be uncovered and expressed to treat the psychological pain, as the theory sort of goes. So I am going to pause you while I plumb the depths of my psyche so I can purge myself of my repressed memories. And I'm going to let some advertisements seep into your subconscious so that they will cause you pain and trauma later. All right, now express that pain and trauma and you'll be purged of the ads. And we're back.
Now, Freud further speculated that this essentially starts right away in life. So, for instance, he argued that infants are aware of their own helplessness, which is an awful thought.
Right.
Immediately. Horrible. And that this knowledge is traumatic, and that this is why babies attach to their mothers, out of fear of being unable to fend for themselves. Specifically, that the first intrinsic experience is fear, and that the attachment to a mother is secondary and not intrinsic.
Yeah. Very sweet.
Yeah, it's very sweet. Yeah, it's a whole thing. Now, in effect, as being a baby is universally consistent across all humans, Freud very cleverly created time-independent job security for himself and all future psychoanalysts, because we all must overcome the trauma of being born. To be fair, life is pretty traumatic, so.
Yeah, sort of like, well, everybody needs psychotherapy because everybody was born. I'm like, okay.
I think I would go, everybody needs therapy, not necessarily because we were born, but because we exist in a place where everything is horrible.
Yeah, well, it is a lot to ask for a species as resource consumption heavy, as prolific and transient as we are, to coordinate in a complex network of social exchanges without damage also happening.
Yeah.
And because that is a nearly impossible task, damage does happen a lot. And so it is an inevitable part of life that we experience some amount of suffering. And so for that reason, yes, I agree.
Yes.
That makes sense to therefore have therapy.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway. As we mentioned, unconscious and repression are two of the main ideas of psychoanalysis. This hidden meaning one is also very important and related to that. Of course, one of the most famous is the idea that our minds exist along a taxonomy of sort of three dimensions. And that, as many people will recognize, are the id, ego, and superego, famously represented by an iceberg.
Mm-hmm. So a quick sidebar in case someone didn't know. The reason for the iceberg is that icebergs are extremely heavy, up to tens of millions of tons heavy, but they are also less dense than water. So thus, an iceberg poking out of the water that we can observe represents only a small fraction of the entirety of the iceberg, which by implication means that the vast majority of the iceberg is hidden below the surface of the water. Freud felt that this metaphor well described the mind. We can see a small part of it, but 90% of our mind, or up to 90% of our mind at least, is unobservable to us, like an iceberg. That's the hypothesis that he's kind of come up with. Plus, icebergs are very, very cold and often covered in bird shit. So that is a whole nother part of this where, maybe like a pigeon farmer has the same kind of experience. I don't know. I do think it's an effective metaphor if you are describing the unconscious and describing it like, hey, there are things that we cannot see below the surface. Like, I think it's an effective metaphor for what he's trying to describe.
Yes. Yeah, no, I do think that and that's why it's lasted, I think, as long as it has. Now, in case you're wondering, or you forgot, I forgot, on the iceberg, the segments of the mind that we can view. So again, we're looking at the iceberg. There's some segments of the mind that are poking out that are visible to us. That's a portion of the superego and a portion of the ego. Most of the superego and ego are still underwater, where they are unconscious and what he called preconscious. Mm-hmm. And the id is completely submerged on the bottom part of the iceberg. So the id is entirely unconscious.
Yeah. So, and the id is the instant gratification, childlike reward-seeking part of the psyche. So that's like kind of like the thing that we're like, we need this now. Give it to me.
Yeah. Gimme.
Yeah. Mine. It's the seagulls from Finding Nemo. That's the id.
Yeah. is the way that Matt Gaze operates at all times.
Mine. Also childlike. The superego is the morally righteous part of the psyche that drives moral and socially responsible behavior, and the ego is the part of the psyche attempting to control the conflict that arises between the id and the superego. So it's okay if you don't remember these or get them confused because they don't matter. So essentially what it is like the Tasmanian devil, and the superego is like, I don't know, maybe like Porky Pig, the one that's like kind of like the like, it's okay. And then the ego is Bugs Bunny between them going, whoa, guys, hold on. The ego's a little bit chaotic, but also kind of keeps everybody in check and keeps the Tasmanian devil from eating Porky Pig.
That is a really fun comparison. I like it. I've never heard anything quite like it.
It just came to me because and I don't know why, because I haven't watched Looney Tunes in years. I think I watched Space Jam not too long ago, but I also like the Tasmanian devil, just thinking him just go, blah, 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 like that noise that he makes is all wild.
Fair.
Yeah.
All right. Although we mentioned depression, there's actually one of several defense mechanisms. Another name that has more or less made its way into popular culture, if someone says that's my defense mechanism, that comes from Freudian psychoanalysis.
Huh?
And so besides repression, these include denial, which is what it sounds like, projections. This is actually one that's also fairly well known and used somewhat commonly, but this is where an individual places their own problems on another person in terms of them assuming that whatever their problem is the motivation for one other person's behavior. Displacement, which is taking out your anger or frustration on someone else, which is also called redirecting in some circles, usually in a socially unacceptable way.
Mm-hmm.
Sublimation is the same exact idea as displacement, but it's taking out in a socially acceptable way, such as focusing on a constructive hobby. And then regression is another defense mechanism, the last one. This is the idea of moving backward through developmental stages. So you turned into a earlier version of yourself. Yeah. Not in looks, but mentally.
I've seen that one used a lot when people are quote unquote regressing. It's like, oh, they're like acting like they were in their 20s. And it's like, well, that's not, there's other things probably going on there. Would not necessarily call that regression. There's some interesting things to kind of unpack within that. But
would you say that if there was a woman who was regressing to her teenage popular high school self, that it was a regression to the mean?
Nice. I wasn't sure how you were going to sneak in an internal validity term into this, but I'm glad that you did that.
Boom, nailed it.
That is such a deep cut. Like, such a deep cut. For all our behavior analyst friends that remember studying experimental design in school, that is a good one. So, psychoanalytic theory also includes a theory of development as a bonus. So like, ta-da, we get this other thing. And there are 5 distinct stages, and they are all sexual. Of course they are. Stage 1 is oral. Stage 2 is anal. Stage 3 is phallic. And that's where you're going to see some discussions around the Oedipus Complex, which is the sexual envy against males, specifically father figures, and an attraction toward opposite sex, specifically the mother figure. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's been debunked time and time again, I believe.
Yeah, and this just for people, the reason it's called Oedipus is it comes from this Greek tragedy where, let me summarize this really briefly. There is a couple, I think they're like a king and queen in the story, or some prominent figures. They're told by some prophecy that their son would kill the father and marry the mother. And so to prevent this, they cripple his feet and leave him on the side of a hill. And that's what Oedipus actually means, I think, is clubfoot. And then someone finds Oedipus and saves him and raises him. And then he journeys back to his hometown. Now, I mean, they don't know where he came from or anything. So he just happens to be traveling there. There's a riddle of the Sphinxes in there, I think. And anyway, he gets back, discovers this beautiful woman, falls in love with her. At some point, kills her husband, this man that's in his way. I don't remember exactly how that transpires. And then turns out after they've like married and had children, that the woman he married was his mother and the person he killed was his father. And so that's sort of why it's all related. The idea that people want to, when they're young males, that they want to replace their father and have sex with their mother. That was Freud's hang up on that.
Yeah. And then there's also the Electra complex, which is the same, but in the opposite direction. And what that essentially means is that the woman, she believes she's been castrated, blames her mother, and experiences penis envy as a result of that. So, yep. Now, let's get out of stage 3, which is phallic. Stage 4 is latent, and stage 5 is genital. So those are the 5 stages of development according to psychoanalysis: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital, in that order.
Yeah, and just for clarity, the phallic is like, this is often characterized by masturbation, where genital is characterized by sex with a partner.
Yep.
In some capacity. So there's still all sexual stimulation. That was his thing.
Yep. All of it. Literally every level.
Okay. So we are not Freudian scholars, but want to do our best to sort of, I think, unpack this in a succinct, clear way. The reading that we are able to do seems to indicate that psychoanalysis could be distilled into those ideas, that these three ideas generally. First, that we all have trauma with varying degrees of intensity that starts when we're born, but may continue to compound throughout our lives. Second, that our minds defend us, a different us than our minds. Apparently, there's like an us and then our mind, and those are like different things. And
there's a super us and an id us and an ego us.
Sure. So our minds defend us from trauma by repressing it so that it is unavailable to our conscious mind. Third, those repressed memories then cause suffering, which is observed in the hidden meaning of subtle vocalizations, such as slips of the tongue, jokes, and dreams, and that those must be expressed consciously to relieve the tension of those traumas, resulting in what would later be coined as the term catharsis.
Mm-hmm. Great band.
There are several psychoanalytic treatments and practices that were used, some that still are, and many new ones that have been developed, but this is essentially called the affect trauma model. And so that's kind of psychoanalysis in a nutshell, is those sort of three main things. Is we have trauma, that's just part of being born. We repress the trauma, we express the trauma to heal from it.
Right. I think for some folks that makes logical sense. Right? Like, I mean, like,
sure.
If you really boil it down, it's there's a problem. We have engaged in coping skills to address or avoid that problem. And then going to therapy or addressing it directly helps to heal that problem. Right? So like, that's essentially like, if you boil it down like that, it's like, it sounds really nice.
Yeah.
And we're going to kind of continue to unpack this, but I think that's like, I think to me, that's an easier way to digest this. If you're having a hard time with like the theory and the terms, like that's essentially what they're getting at.
Yeah.
To be charitable.
Yes. Yeah. Trying to be as much as possible.
Yeah. Now, there are so many other things that we could unpack about the theory and various facets that came to be, but I believe doing so would be beyond the scope of this conversation and well beyond the interest of these hosts. Also, I think well beyond kind of like, you know, we mentioned we're not Freudian scholars. So like having somebody who studies that day in, day out might be able to unpack that a little bit better or differently, I should say.
Yeah, there might be one or two of our listeners who are big into psychoanalysis and they would love to reach out to us and add something to this discussion, maybe correct something that we've said up to this point. I invite you to do that.
Yeah.
I would love to have that information. I'm happy to pass that along and share it because ultimately we're trying to convey information in an effective, accurate way so that people don't feel like they listen to us and they walk away knowing less than they did before. That is generally the strategy of the RNC and not how I would like to proceed with our podcast.
Also, too, I would like to say, besides, I 100% agree with that. I would like to say that this is a theoretical orientation within the field of psychology. This is not pseudoscientific. So, like, I think that, like, there is a difference when we get into pseudoscience and we are far less charitable and a little bit mean. This is something that, like, has some research, at least parts of it have some research to support its use and why it's sustained and why it's, you know, and so like, and we'll talk about that in some way. So like, if you have thoughts that you want to share, we would love to hear it.
Okay. I feel like, is this an appropriate time for us to take a snack break and let the advertisers have their way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got party nuts over here.
You've got nuts. I've got tacos. We'll take a break and be right back. Nom, 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 nom. All right, returning to our conversation. So we've more or less spent this time just trying to explain a little bit about Freud, talk generally about what psychoanalysis is. Where does a post-Sigmund Freud psychoanalysis world go?
Yeah, so I think there are a few important things to understand about the radical nature of Freud's ideas in relation to the historical precedent of the zeitgeist.
Shane, what does zeitgeist mean?
Zeitgeist is the unreleased Smashing Pumpkins album that for some reason will not show up on Spotify and has a really great song. That's The Way My Love Goes. They had a really cool video and for some reason it won't end up on Spotify. So
that's a good definition.
That is a good definition. Especially recently I saw Smashing Pumpkins and they played not a song from Zeitgeist, which was weird. Now, the term zeitgeist, it means the defining spirit or mood of a particular period of history as shown by the ideas and beliefs of the time. So the sentence here says, the story captured the zeitgeist of the late 1960s. A way to distill that down or like kind of like really provide, it's just basically like what's current, what's in everybody's language, lexicon, like slang. I feel like if you talk about the 90s, then like slang terms like tubular, radical, gnarly, like stuff like that, like that's part of the cultural zeitgeist that is the 90s. Also neon colors, also chain wallets, all of those things existed in the 90s as part of like the overall cultural zeitgeist. So it's kind of like a time capsule of a period, and kind of you can look at like different elements of that within that particular time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. That was great. Synthesis of that definition. Synthesis meaning to bring together.
Yeah.
Call back to our definitions earlier on. And so, yeah, this whole thing is how to understand what was going on at the time of the development of psychoanalysis in the sort of theoretical world of psychology more generally.
Yeah. So I think as we go forward, there are a few things to kind of really understand about this. Primarily, when we look at the post-Sigmund Freud world, a lot of Freud's ideas and kind of like the culture at the time, a lot of it had to do with how people understood human behavior. There were a few ideas, but not really a lot of like kind of more formal ideas or really fleshed out ideas.
Yeah.
One commonly held idea was that humanity was God's greatest creation and was ruled by logic and reason, which we know absolutely is not true. Not the God part. I'm not going to get into that, but the logic and reason part, absolutely. Now, presumably, then there were really only one reason for people to do bad things: something opposed to God, or a demon, or Satan, or denying God, or something like that. So basically, if you're doing bad things, it's going against God's will because we are a perfect logical creature.
And so, yeah, this is all sort of, as Freud's developing his theories, this is what the alternative kind of was. Another idea was that all things were entirely rooted in the physical, in your physiology. That is, every psychological problem was necessarily a physical problem, a physical medical problem that was caused by physical trauma of some kind. So if there was anything that you were exhibiting that was suffering or whatnot, it was because you had to have had some kind of physical trauma that caused that reaction.
Yep. There were some ideas about events of the mind as existing and possibly being important, but there were few terms or concrete ideas or cohesive theories about that. And Freud was one of the earliest people to propose a system of understanding human behavior that proposed essentially the opposite, which is that there were things that we could kind of dig into and look at and really kind of psychoanalyze.
So Freud created one of the first and most widely adopted understandings of human behavior as being influenced by environmental circumstances. And I cannot actually be stressed enough that at the point that this was developed, it was a very, very radically new idea to suggest that people's learning environment could have an effect on who they became and what they did. And what that means by implication is that people are not necessarily to blame for their inappropriate behavior, but instead it was their damaged psyche that caused their problem. And by extension, part of this too is that then there kind of was no such thing as this idealized normal. There's not like a normal human way to be, but that idea of there not being normal did come later in his career.
Yeah.
But that was kind of an implication that you could easily see following from the logic that, well, if humans do learn from their environments, if they're affected by their circumstances, then that means that those circumstances are to blame for what they do because it damaged their psyche in this theory. And that means that there's also no one thing that is ideal or normal because everybody's going to have their own individual experiences that creates who they are as a person. And that was very radical at the time that could even be proposed. I mean, that really took the wind out of the sails of people who were like, people who do bad things need to be put to death,
right?
Because they are inherently broken and cannot be fixed because that's just who they are. When Freud's saying, no, there are people who have been damaged and damaged people do wrong things and we can treat them so they don't do wrong things. That was really, really different from where people are at.
So for our folks that listen to this that might be behavioral, I think this is one of those things that was kind of like a moment, like an aha moment for me, where it's like the path to get to the end result is a little bit different. But the core value, there is a shared value here where it is people are not bad. It's their either A, damaged psyches, or B, learning history. You could interchange those on some level, and it kind of ultimately means the same thing. You don't blame the learner. They have a learning history / damaged psyche. Okay. And then there's no idea of normal because we have to look at the context. I mean, it is a shared value through and through. It's just we're using different languaging around it and have different ways to get there.
Yeah. And this is exactly why I found like some of this actually does stand up fairly well to like a scientific objective interpretation of human behavior. Like, I can totally jive with that. I think it makes sense.
Yeah. It makes me less angry at this.
Yeah.
Like, it makes me go and like, oh yeah, like this, it actually absolutely makes a lot of sense. Now, there are disagreements among even devoted acolytes, and they began quickly, even while Freud was still alive. The author we use for a lot of the content of this history, Diana Kenny, argued that there were 4 main points of disagreement with Freud. 1 was the emphasis on original psychic causes compared to environmental circumstances. 2, the emphasis on sexuality. 3, techniques of therapeutic action. And 4, the pathological development originally proposed. So there are some arguments even within the theory itself.
Yeah, I mean, they start to break off really quickly and diverge pretty significantly. And there are several theories that were developed that, for the sake of time, we won't go in depth into those theories, but they really did heavily shape the future of psychoanalysis. So we're going to at least list a few main prominent figures and some of what they contributed. And these are names that I've only briefly heard some of them, but some of them I'd never heard before. But one of the first ones is called objects relations theory. This is proposed by Melanie Klein, first published in like the early 1920s. So this was while Freud was still alive. And this essentially posits that all experiences are mental and that we cannot be unsure of anything that is not a mental experience. Hers had to do a lot with infancy and that sort of thing, and sort of people developing out of infancy. This is what is called solipsism, the idea that only mental is real and everything that we experience is kind of, I mean, this is sort of Plato, right? This is the shadows in the cave and that sort of thing. So that's where Melanie Klein was coming from.
Yeah. We've also got Heinz Hartzman, who believed that the interpersonal relationships were critically important to the development of both traumatic experiences and cures for those traumas. And so this is kind of where you might start seeing a little bit of like social psychology and like pro-social behavior and like interactions. Like this is really kind of like the heart of it, where, you see the actual importance placed on the individual in the context of relations with other people.
Right. Yeah. And that was different because, again, Freud's was like, we suffer these traumas, but Hartman was like, yeah, but the thing is, like, it's not just the sexual, it's not just the repressed, it's the relationships we have with people because we're social animals. And so I also could kind of get on board with some of that. Harry Stack Sullivan believed that tender, loving emotions were highly sensitive to invalidating attacks. So for him, the traumas really stemmed from mockery or ridicule, particularly when someone was being vulnerable, and that would then be triggering for future experiences where someone had the opportunity to be vulnerable.
Now, some of the previously mentioned and many others also believe that the nature of the relationship of the patient to the therapist, the analyzed-analyzer relationship, we'll say, as it is described often, was of paramount importance to the therapeutic context. And this effect is actually entirely correct and has been empirically validated in several studies. I mean, and there are a lot of different ways they talk about this. They talk about Therapeutic Alliance.
Right.
They talk about building rapport. There's all different ways to talk about what this is, but there are many, many studies that say this is critical to support any sort of therapeutic benefit.
Yeah, and this developed adjacent to Freud. I don't think he pushed necessarily that idea of that relationship, but most other people who came up, even his proteges, were like, no, we actually really need to focus on this relationship. This is a very essential piece of this thing. And they're absolutely correct.
Yep, 100%.
Now, one of the most notable dissenters from Freud's original theories was one of his proteges, say it with me,
Carl Jung,
whom Freud described as creating a twisted reinterpretation of his theories.
Oh, nice.
No love lost there.
Nope.
Jung's altered psychoanalysis even came with a new name. This is analytical psychology. And one author that we found proposed 3 ways that analytical psychology differed from psychoanalysis. There's the magic number 3. It's going to come back some more.
It's a magic number. First, Jung believed that libido was responsible for drives that could be observed in a wide range of human activity rather than Freud's belief that libido only sought to gratify sexual desire. So basically Jung saying libido is everything.
I'll acknowledge right now that I've heard some people pronounce it Jung. So if you prefer Jung or Jung, it's spelled with a J. So in America, it's Jung.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
Yeah. If you're speaking American, it is Jung.
That's right. And I think in some of the Spanish languages, it would be pronounced hung.
Or hung.
So Jung believed that the unconscious stored all repressed memories and also somehow the collective memories of all of mankind throughout history. There's that. So he's kind of a mystic in that way. Whereas Freud believed that the unconscious represented trauma and impulses and desires only. So again, the unconscious was really just that repressed trauma. Whereas for Jung, it was kind of everything.
This leads me to the question, because I feel like that idea of collective memory and like collective consciousness came around. There was a lot of mysticism going around that time. I am now curious of whether or not Jung and Aleister Crowley ever shared space.
Oh.
I mean, we should probably eventually do an episode on Aleister Crowley because he had, there was all kinds of other things going on there.
Yeah.
And we'll keep that PG for sure because this is a PG show.
Family-friendly show.
We're trying to get on Disney Plus.
That's right.
So,
boy, the money we'd get from that.
Oh, but I do wonder if there is like some shared like teachings or shared texts or even just like some like opium den discussions between the two of them.
We have had this idea of shared consciousness of people on the docket for topics for a very long time. Not quite as long as psychoanalysis, but for a long time. So yeah, I think we've sort of now started to outline the path of Aleister Crowley psychoanalysis, yes. Merging those ideas of the sort of shared consciousness of humanity like a fungal mushroom. Yeah.
We'll get into like left-hand path and stuff. We'll get into mysticism, all kinds of wild things. I mean,
Fun.
We don't have to today. We'll do that later.
Yeah.
So Jung believed that anticipations about the future and our past experiences influenced our behavior, whereas Freud believed only that the past influenced our behavior, which pretty interesting to think about when you really kind of unpack that.
Yeah, also not terribly unaligned from where we might find ourselves.
Right.
All right, I would like to talk about someone named Jacques Lacan, or Lacan maybe, and Lacanian psychology. But first, I'm realizing that we've reached the moment once more where we let the advertising infect your dreams. And that means something important.
Which is probably an ad that you've already heard because of the collective consciousness.
Yeah, that's right. All right, return from your deep void of unconscious, and we will get back to what we were talking about. So Jacques Lacan, or Lacan, I didn't look it up, but I'm assuming it's something like that. He was a mid-20th century psychoanalyst who believed that the unconscious was critically important, but also that language was very important for understanding human psychology. I know, right? And because things happen in threes, as we've said, he also had three key components of this language hypothesis.
So first was the real, in which the human mind is grounded, as we understand it, in the natural world without language. The real seems to be the state of being that includes instinctual drives, food, water, shelter, sex, and language completely dismantles this relationship by imposing interpretations and meaning and assumptions on top of the raw experience automatically and unintentionally. So the real is just kind of our animal, just like what our basic needs.
Yeah.
And then when we add language to it, we distort whatever that need is through some kind of languaging or interpretation.
Yeah, it goes away. And so these progress in sort of an order of operations. And the next one, interestingly, is called Symbolic Order. And this is the next stage that we experience once we learn that language. So we start with the real, we learn language, it destroys the real, and we reach the Symbolic Order. This too is broken into threes, but we're not going to expand on them any further because 9 is too many. But it's mostly important to know that in this part, desires and emotions are part of the Symbolic Order stage, and that this stage is in conflict with the real stage.
You might be picking up a pattern too, where like different parts or different stages are in conflict with one another, and that may cause some strife for the human who is constantly in conflict.
Common way of being.
Yeah. The final stage is the mirror stage. And this is when we become aware of our, quote, self. This is when an infant can look into a mirror and understand that the baby in the mirror is not another baby, but themselves. This silly test has long enamored many psychologists who are deeply fascinated with mirrors of all things.
This comes up so often. They love mirrors. It's like a thing for them. They're like, but I know that the person in the mirror isn't another person. I'm like, cool. I'm going to show you a chalk on sidewalk sometime. It'll blow your mind.
Wait till you see two mirrors at the same time. How many people are there? Forever. That's how many.
That's right. Look at this marble. It's perfectly smooth. It rolls wherever you send it. One more person we'll profile just really quick, for the sake of time, is Erickson, another probably familiar name to many people who at least have some contact with psychology and developmental psychology. Erickson proposed growth and development throughout the lifespan rather than stopping at the influences of childhood only. This is another one that I think I would definitely be in support of as behavior analyst. And his psychosocial developmental stages or stages of development are associated with a particular age range, characterized by a crisis, and then a virtue that is developed at that stage. So briefly, we'll just summarize those.
Yeah. So the first stage is birth to 18 months. The crisis is trust versus mistrust with a developed virtue of Hope.
The next stage is 18 months to 3 years. The crisis is autonomy versus shame or doubt. The developed virtue is will.
Now, 3 to 5 years, the crisis is initiative versus guilt, and the developed virtue is purpose.
5 to 13 years, the crisis is industry versus inferiority, and the developed virtue is competency.
Now, 13 to 21 years, the crisis is identity versus confusion, and the developed virtue is fidelity.
21 to 39 years, the crisis is intimacy versus isolation, and the developed virtue is love.
Oh, that's sweet. 40 to 65 years is the crisis of generativity versus stagnation, and the developed virtue is care.
And then finally, 65 years and older, the crisis is integrity versus despair, and the developed virtue is wisdom.
That sounds so fun.
Yeah.
Like, all of that sounds very fun.
All right, I'm just going to throw out some quick names really quick of other people who were part of the development of psychoanalysis over time that we don't really have time to go into, but there's Carl Abraham, Otto Rank, John Bowlby, big developmental guy, Melanie Klein, we did mention Karen Horney, and Sabina Spielrein.
Yeah.
Yeah. I said it 3 times, so I've now summoned her or him. These are major contributors to this as it developed.
Now the question that we kind of have to ask as we start to wrap this up is, where are they now? And that would be psychoanalysts, not Freud. Freud is dead. We know that. We established that earlier in the show.
Yes. And pretty much all the people that most of the other people we mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are only a few remaining psychoanalysts who fully subscribe to the Freudian model of psychology. Most people who practice some version of this use evolved theories and techniques that have been pioneered from others. Jung and Erickson in particular really left significant impacts on the field of psychoanalysis that last into modern contemporary psychoanalytic practice and theory to this day.
So psychoanalysis has gone through some re-envisioning and some retooling and diversified greatly since Freud's inception and kind of like the discussion, like the big psychology boom in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so today there are mostly 3. Again, with the 3s, it's always the 3s. It's like, you know what it is? That explains why Dale Earnhardt selected 3 for his car number. For like, that's because he was just above the rest. So 3s, it must be an important number.
Yeah.
It is truly a magic number. Hail Dale.
Trinity from The Matrix.
Also, one of my favorite phrases living in Daytona is raise hell, praise Dale is a term that you'll hear every now and again.
There's a metal band called 3.
There you go. See, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Now, there are 3 main domains of psychoanalysis. First, there's applied psychoanalysis, which seems to be the study of real-world endeavors through a psychoanalytic lens. There's neuropsychoanalysis, which is a hybrid of neuroscience and psychoanalysis, such as investigating dreams and whatnot. So that's kind of an interesting thing to kind of see that combination.
Yeah.
And then there's also psychotherapy or psychoanalytic therapy, which is just an actual therapeutic application of the work.
Right. We couldn't find any hard numbers, but it's easy to suspect that there are at least on the order of thousands of practicing psychoanalysts in the United States today, across the sort of many fields that we mentioned above. And then there are also many that would not call themselves psychoanalysts, but they are practicing in fields that are more or less emerged from psychoanalysis, such as existentialism. And these are not generally referred to as psychoanalysis, but those are out there. So at least as of the 2000 to 2010 era, I found one source that suggested that there were over 30 training institutes where one could become a psychoanalyst. So yeah, the major heyday of being a psychoanalyst has kind of shifted, but still around. There are plenty of people who would call themselves psychoanalysts, but yeah, the hardcore original Freudian version of this is all but gone, I think, at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to note that there's some really interesting research, and this is something I just kind of want to share, is like I've read some research where there is like a kind of a crossover of psychoanalysis and behaviorism, where they are really looking at the languaging from a psychoanalytic standpoint, but they're looking at interventions from a behavior analytic standpoint and seeing kind of how effective that can be. And so there is some really cool crossover stuff out there. So I think it would be a disservice to completely blow this off as like, oh, it's a whatever thing, just because it's not the same theoretical orientation that we might subscribe to.
It's actually a beautiful segue into talking about, I think that we would be remiss if we didn't just critique a little bit of this in the last few minutes of this discussion.
Sure.
And I think that you're exactly right, is that some of this really does not conflict with an objective science view. You can work in many of the ideas that are here in a behavior and science oriented interpretation of human behavior and human psychology. A lot of it, like they line up pretty nicely. I mean, one of the things, as we said, that we 100% are on board with is the fact that we believe that our environmental circumstances impact our behavior, and that early childhood experiences are important for the developmental trajectory of an individual. Not to the same level, same degree, or same way, but that value is shared in its entirety, pretty much.
Yeah. I think another thing, too, that was a really nice alignment was the importance of language. And eventually, when you get into like verbal behavior and understanding radical behaviorism and the idea that languaging is important for accessing private events and private stimuli, like that absolutely tracks with you can't understand somebody's quote unquote psyche without them being able to language about it.
Right.
I just thought that was really fascinating and kind of like an overall, a nice tie-in that I hadn't really thought about or focused on before when I had studied psychodynamics.
And another thing that I think I'll say with where I feel like we're in a lot of agreement here is the fact that because we look at the circumstances of someone's environment and how that affects who they are and what they do, that we also see blame as essentially being a relatively unnecessary and counterproductive way of looking at when humans do things that are less than ideal. And instead, like, what are the circumstances that produce that? Now, I know we like to toss a lot of politicians under the bus in here, and that's because they're easy public figures that are fun to poke fun at because they do terrible things.
Yeah.
But really, when we lean in our compassion to the science, we understand that they started as children who went through a series of experiences that led them to a place where they do terrible things as people, and that is not an uncorrectable position. It's difficult, but not impossible. And that their behavior is perfectly understandable if you were to look at the full context of where they came from and how they got to where they are, usually being fully indoctrinated in some weird orgy cult, apparently.
Yeah.
According to other politicians.
That's a podcast for another day.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
But there's plenty that we critique, I think, in here.
I think with that being said, I think there is plenty to unpack that has either been kind of left behind in the wake of an ever forward-moving science kind of perspective, or like some of the things that they were kind of like cited as like, these are things, right? Like the id, the ego, the superego, the unconscious, those types of things have been essentially been made null and void. Like they're not useful overall in terms of like a therapeutic application and stuff. And so like to me, when somebody's like the unconscious, it doesn't really make any sense to me. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I'm just kind of like, I don't see how that has carried over from that mystical time, because I think that mysticism has been kind of lost. I think it's starting to come back because people are really into crystals right now, but but I think mysticism overall has kind of been like lost the more that we've learned about human behavior. Yeah,
no, you're exactly right. Is where I felt original hostility toward this was in these very, very fuzzy, ill-defined concepts that I felt like you could speculate anything and it would have as much validity as the nonsense they were coming up with. And the unconscious is one where it's like, again, what does that mean? Like everybody keeps talking about consciousness and nobody's bothering to even remotely attempt to define it in any way. And even when they do, it usually ends up diminishing the concept to something that is no longer carrying the weight that it would if we were to just say unconscious, unexplained.
Right.
And so leaning on the idea that there is this unconscious without bothering to talk about what does that mean? What is unconscious? Like even just objectively, if I look at something, like, how would I know that something is unconscious or not? And the fact that he just sort of brazenly is like, nope, it's just unconscious. Just is.
Yeah.
Everything's unconscious.
It's a good MacGuffin.
Exactly. So a lot of people who I think are hardcore scientists came out and said, like, what we found out that Freud was really right about is how much that we do that we're unconscious of. And again, what they seem to be saying is, it's things that we don't identify or label the fact that they're happening. That's all it is. That's all it ever comes down to, is that we kind of can focus our attention in a relatively narrow band of space and time, and that we can't pay attention to certain things that our bodies do or that we do because we get hyperfluent at things and we automate, right? And so that's why, as I'm hyperfluent at being able to walk and put one foot in front of the other. And so I can walk and think about something else at the same time and talk about something and chew gum, as they say, walk and chew gum.
Right.
Because like I'm so fluent at walking that like that is something of which I am not actively making attempts toward unless I'm in like some altered state of consciousness. Right. But yeah, for the most part, like that seems to be what they're referring to, is like things that are so fluent that we don't pay attention to them, things that we can't tact because we have no frame of reference for what they are, like the things that part of my biology is doing, like my pancreas, and things for which like we are not given appropriate stimulation such that we could react meaningfully toward those things. Meaning like I can't recall a memory because I have insufficient cues or because it's been way too long and I've not had sufficient cues in the interim. And so like the stimulus control that was once there for that memory is now gone. Like that seems to be things they're talking about. But to just say it's unconscious.
Yeah.
Doesn't further the analysis at all.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything to like make any forward progress.
Right.
And I would say, okay, so maybe at the time it was useful. So let's take a step back. Maybe at the time it was useful when there was nothing else. Like at the very least, it was a better explanation than nothing, and maybe putting somebody to death over something. So like I do think that maybe had its use at the time, but I think what has happened is it's been outgrown.
Yes.
And I think with the amount of research that is current and the amount of stuff that we know and understand about human behavior and learning and all of those other things, I think that we can let it go. And I think that's the thing that I get stuck on is like, I don't care if you want to use terms unconscious and stuff like that.
Right.
But I think using it in a therapeutic context doesn't make any sense anymore since we know more about the world around us. And that goes back to, I think, my issue with philosophic doubt. It's like, let it go. It is okay that we do not need these constructs that were at one time helpful, but are no longer helpful for providing a metaphor or understanding what somebody's learning history actually is.
100%.
Like there is agreement on environmental context, environmental circumstances. We do know that learning histories influence the way people do things. We do know that neurology influences those because of advancements in science. And unconscious simply didn't stand up to the rigor. The ego, the superego, those things that are more fluffy did not stand up to the scientific rigor that has come across in the decades since their inception. And so I think that's where I get stuck on the most is those folks that are ignoring decades of research and evidence in lieu of something that simply has been refuted.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And absolutely, you're 100% correct. And the other ideas I think that are similar that can be left in the past are some of the extreme emphasis on sexuality. And I think that for the most part, psychoanalysis has left a lot of that behind.
Yeah.
It is much less oriented around sex than it used to be. And I think, again, being charitable here, understanding that sex is a large primary driver of human behavior in the sense that it is one of those primary reinforcers. We don't have to learn that it has reinforcing value like food, water, sleep, and shelter.
Right. There's straight up an evolutionary benefit to it.
And you could easily take any one of those primary reinforcers that has evolutionary benefit and couch your entire theory around that. Like, let's make hunger the thing.
Yeah.
Let's make shelter the thing.
Resource seeking.
Yeah, exactly right. Like, you just take one of those. And that's the thing is, like, it was too narrow. It didn't include enough of those components. And the emphasis on sex was way too extreme. But that's also, like, that's in the past now. And so I think those were things where I felt, so again, that sort of hostility toward the idea. But it's come a long way. And so I think, just as you said, whether you use those terms, I don't really care. But yeah, in clinical practice, they just are not useful any longer. We know better now. So,
I mean, and I think that's where I would land too. It's like, I think we got to it earlier where we would be remiss to ignore this or to write this off as just like another like psychobabble type of thing when it's not the case. Like there's a lot of really great stuff to unpack within the psychodynamic psychoanalysis world that I don't think that a lot of people give it credit for because of the jokes about sexuality and cigars and like in the Freudian slips and all that stuff. I think that there's a lot of jokes about old psychodynamics and not current psychodynamics.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of room for collaboration here. So I hope that came across in feeling that we were somewhat charitable.
Yeah.
And that I think that we also see that like there's merit in these ideas. We may not agree entirely in philosophy, but I think that doesn't mean that there's not room for us to find common ground and work and move forward.
Absolutely. 100%.
All right. Do you have anything else before we get to some recommendations?
No, I think that covers it. That feels good.
Sweet. Very good. All right. Let's recommend some things.
Let's do it.
Recommendations.
Okay. I am following up my last recommendation, which was a board game by the same publisher of a different board game. And this board game is called The Whatnot Cabinet. Again, this is playable in probably less than an hour. Goes up to 4 players. Essentially, it is a tile laying game. And what you're trying to do is fill a sort of a grid. The players get sort of a grid in front of them. That's supposed to be a cabinet thematically. And there's a bunch of objects and colors, and you're trying to line up columns of colors and rows of objects. But there's limited. There's only like so many. You draw these tiles from a bag that are in front of you, and you can take certain actions to try and add to that, or like wipe the table, or like, get extra draws or something. But whatever, you try and take these actions to get the tiles that you want so that you can get lining up the same objects in same colors, or all different objects, all different colors, to get points for it. It's sort of this sort of abstract, I said sort of like 4 times there. I guess I would describe it as this abstract pattern puzzle game,
Sure.
where you're sort of competing for a shared space of tiles with other players. It's quick, it's easy, it requires some some sort of logical deduction, or a little bit of risk taking in terms of your draws. But anyway, this is the Whatnot Cabinet from Pencil First Games is my recommend.
That sounds so fun. I love that. I'm going to recommend a local cafe. So if you are ever in the Daytona Beach area where I live, you can stop by this place. And it's a little cafe called Casual Bird.
You'll find Shane there.
You'll find me there because this place is delicious. So it's this tiny little cafe. It's on the beach side. So you can actually, as you're driving up over the bridge to Casual Bird, you can see the beach and see the ocean. And it's beautiful. And they do breakfast, lunch, Southern fare type of stuff. And they call it Southern Beach Fare. So it's like pretty light breakfast, fresh fruit, stuff like that. My son and I went yesterday and he got a bagel and he said it was the best bagel he's ever had. So I was kind of like, he's 9, so he hasn't had many bagels, but it was enough to kind of like a glaring recommendation there.
Nice.
They make coffee in-house. They have a local roaster that comes in and they do everything. So like everything is really, really fresh and really wonderful. And then in the afternoons, they have it looks like a van parked in the back. It's like a stationary van kind of truck, and it's like a little ice cream shop that they run. It's like, it looks like a food truck that's kind of like parked in the back as like a supplemental thing to do that. So it's really, really great, really nice, and a nice quiet little place to relax on the beach.
Casual Bird Cafe. Mm-hmm. All right, those are 2 recommendations: Whatnot Cabinet board game and Casual Bird Cafe. If you're in the Daytona area, maybe you're already in the Daytona area, and you want to come by and try and scope out Shane, he might be there.
Or just tell me you're in the Daytona area and I'll say hi.
Perfect. All right, well, we need to wrap this thing up. So this has been a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course.
If you would like to support this podcast, as I mentioned at the top, if you leave us a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe to ensure that we're always showing up in your feed so you can listen to episodes and our ads can play and we can make ad revenue money, that's one way you can do it. You can directly give us some money if you'd like to join us on Patreon. There you'll get access to early episodes, ad-free episodes, discounts on merch if you sign up at a particular level, a shout out, which you'll hear in a moment. That sort of things. And we're working on some other perks as well. And then some just behind the scenes stuff that you get for sort of fun for being there. And then otherwise, if you would like to support us without necessarily being a Patreon supporter, you could have a very fancy, lovely, delightful coffee mug that says something about why we do what we do as a podcast on it.
Yeah.
You could wear a beanie, a shirt, a jacket, carry a water bottle. It would look very cool. The person who is wearing both the shirt, sweater, water bottle, beanie, and has the coffee mug is very hip to the groove.
The coolest. Kind of like what they describe in Billy Madison.
Yes, exactly. The coolest is what you want to be. You can never to our merch store and pick up some of those things there. As I mentioned, there are these awesome Patreon people. They're the ones who make this possible financially, and that includes Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Costia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. You guys rock.
You're the best. You're so great.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to my team, of course, which is Justin, Selena, Kyle, Alan, and I already said thank you to Shane.
But you don't need to say it more than once. That's fine. I appreciate it.
Muchos gracias.
De nada.
And yeah, so I think that is all we have. Anything else that I'm missing?
I got nothing else.
All right, this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.